There are things in life that feel almost sacred, untouchable, unbreakable bonds that we hold dear and would never dare cross. One of those bonds, I always thought, was the family we make through our children. Our daughters marry, and we welcome their husbands as our own. But what happens when those sacred boundaries start to blur, and emotions you never wanted to face begin to emerge? My name is Sylvia, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about love, loyalty, and the strength of family. I was content, or at least I believed I was, in my quiet little life after my husband's passing. I found comfort in the visits from my daughter Rachel and her husband Mark, who had been like a steady rock to our family after my husband's death. Then one seemingly ordinary afternoon, something shifted. Mark and I were alone, and a line I'd thought was firm and uncrossable, well, it began to blur. It was subtle at first, a lingering gaze, a few words exchanged that held a strange weight. I was unsettled, but also intrigued. As time went on, the tension grew thicker, the exchanges more charged. What was happening between us was reckless and forbidden, a line we should have never crossed. Yet here we were, teetering on the edge. What came after was a journey I never anticipated, one I'm not sure I'm proud of. But looking back, it's a story I feel compelled to tell. Life had a way of slipping into quiet routines as you aged. Something I became intimately familiar with after losing my husband Jim 5 years ago. For most of our marriage, I was Sylvia Holt, a librarian at the city library, immersed in books and the orderly stillness of my job. Jim was my opposite in so many ways, a vibrant man with a big laugh, the kind who loved throwing family gatherings, bringing people together. Our life was stable, fulfilling in its simplicity. But losing him left an emptiness that lingered, no matter how hard I tried to fill it. These days my home was mostly silent, save for the hum of the radio or the occasional laughter from neighbors' children drifting in through open windows. I often spent my days doing volunteer work, joining a knitting club, or hosting small tea gatherings with friends my age. But in truth, nothing could shake the ache of loneliness. My daughter Rachel visited as often as she could, but her corporate job in the city kept her busy. I was proud of her ambition. She'd always been fiercely independent and hardworking. Rachel had married Mark 7 years ago, and he'd fit into our family seamlessly. He was thoughtful and down to earth, a contractor by trade, and had helped around my house since Jim passed, handling things like leaky faucets, squeaky doors, and other odds and ends. His presence was something I'd come to look forward to. He was steady, dependable, and carried a comforting warmth that reminded me of Jim. Over the years, Mark and I had built a friendly rapport. I could talk to him about things I never shared with anyone else, things that went beyond small talk. He listened patiently, offering gentle advice when needed, but mostly, he was just there. A quiet, calming presence I found myself leaning on. I saw him as a son of sorts, and he treated me with respect and kindness that felt genuine. One afternoon, as he worked on fixing my broken dishwasher, we talked about my late husband, about how Jim had this way of filling every room with laughter, and how empty the house felt without him. Mark listened intently, a look of understanding in his eyes, and for a moment, I felt a comfort I hadn't felt in years. It was almost like Jim was back in the room with us, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward Mark for bringing that feeling back, even if only for a moment. But then, something unexpected began to creep into our interactions. I wasn't sure what it was at first, a fleeting sense of warmth, perhaps, or an exchange that felt just a bit too intimate. We were still polite, our conversations remained friendly, yet there was a certain awareness building in his gaze, a weight in his tone that hadn't been there before. I dismissed it as my imagination. After all, he was married to Rachel, and I was well into my late 60s. Such thoughts were absurd, even embarrassing to entertain. Yet the small exchanges between us felt undeniably different. He'd started coming over more frequently, offering help with mundane tasks, asking about things he'd never shown interest in before. There was a newfound attentiveness in him, and to my shame, I found myself looking forward to those moments, even seeking them out in my mind after he left. It felt harmless, these little instances that only I seemed to notice. They were probably nothing, I told myself. A trick of the mind, a lonely widow's longing for companionship where there was none. Mark was just being kind, a supportive son-in-law filling the gap Jim had left behind. I clung to that explanation, needing it to be true, needing things to remain simple and untainted. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the slight flutter that arose whenever he was near, or the brief glances that lingered longer than they should have. I never let myself dwell on it, yet it persisted in quiet moments, like an uninvited whisper that grew harder to ignore. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in early September when things between Mark and me took an unexpected turn. He'd come by to help fix a loose cabinet door in the kitchen, and Rachel had just left for some errands. Normally, I'd make him a cup of tea while he worked, and we'd chat about small things, my garden, his latest project, the weather. But that day, the conversation veered somewhere different. He finished the repair quickly and, instead of leaving right away, lingered by the kitchen table. He had this contemplative look, like he had something on his mind. Eventually, he asked about my husband, something he'd done occasionally before. But this time, his questions felt more personal, more probing. He asked if I ever felt lonely, if I missed Jim in ways that no one else could understand. The way he asked was so unexpected, so tender. I felt my heart skip slightly, and I found myself answering more honestly than I intended. Yes, I do miss him. Sometimes, it feels like he's still here, just in another room, I said, trying to smile, but my voice wavered slightly. Mark nodded, his gaze soft and understanding. He didn't respond right away, just looked at me with a kind of empathy that was both comforting and unsettling. It's hard to lose someone like that, someone you thought you'd have beside you for much longer, he said, almost in a whisper. I sensed a kind of sorrow in his voice, though he wasn't speaking about himself. At that moment, I felt an odd connection, a deep, quiet understanding that neither of us needed to put into words. It was comforting, but as I looked up at him, I realized he was standing just a little closer than usual. I cleared my throat, breaking the spell that had settled between us. Well, thank you for fixing the cabinet, I said, trying to shift the mood back to something lighter. But as he turned to leave, he placed his hand gently on my shoulder. Just a fleeting touch, yet it lingered in my mind long after he'd gone. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting. Mark seemed to find reasons to come over more often. He'd stop by unannounced, offering to help with this or that, always with that same polite smile. And whenever we were alone, there was an awareness, a tension that simmered beneath the surface, hidden from anyone else but undeniably present to me. One afternoon, he dropped by with some fresh tomatoes from his garden. Rachel wasn't home, and I invited him to stay for a cup of tea. As we sat in the living room, our conversation drifted into unusual territory again. Mark asked about my life before I'd met Jim, about the dreams I'd had, the things I'd wanted for myself. I was caught off guard. No one had asked me questions like that in a long time, and certainly not with the interest that Mark showed. It's been years since anyone asked me that, I admitted, feeling a strange warmth creep over me. Jim and I, well, we made a good life together, but there were things I put aside, things that I don't think anyone remembers about me anymore. Mark looked at me, his expression both gentle and serious. I think you've had a remarkable life, Sylvia, more than you give yourself credit for. His words, spoken with such sincerity, left me speechless. I hadn't felt that seen or valued in ages, and the realization filled me with both gratitude and an unspoken longing that I tried my best to ignore. As he left that day, I was left with a whirl of emotions that I couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just his kindness that affected me. It was the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to truly care about my happiness and well-being. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And it was that feeling, that small spark, that unsettled me the most. In the evenings, as I went about my quiet routines, I found myself thinking of those conversations with Mark. I would catch myself remembering the way he'd touched my shoulder, or the way his gaze softened when he looked at me, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with an excitement I didn't want to acknowledge. What was happening to me? This was my son-in-law, married to my daughter. And yet here I was, letting my thoughts drift into places they had no business going. At dinner with Rachel a few nights later, I couldn't help but glance at Mark across the table, wondering if he felt the same shift that I did. At one point, our eyes met, and a flicker of something passed between us. Something I couldn't name, but that left me feeling strangely exposed. I quickly looked away, focusing on my plate, but my heart was racing, and I knew I was losing control of the situation. After dinner, as Rachel cleared the dishes, Mark offered to help me with some old photo frames I'd mentioned needing to fix. We headed to the garage, and as he worked on tightening the frame, he asked more questions about Jim and me, about our early days together, and about my life before motherhood. Each question seemed to draw me closer to him, peeling back layers I hadn't examined in years. Then, as he handed me the last frame, our fingers brushed, and he didn't pull away right away. We stood there, frozen in place, neither of us speaking, but the air was thick with an unspoken understanding. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, and I felt my cheeks flush. It was the kind of silence that felt loaded with possibility, and yet it terrified me. Finally, I stepped back, laughing awkwardly to break the tension. "Thank you for helping, Mark. I should get back to the kitchen," I stammered, desperate to regain some semblance of normalcy. But as I left the garage, I felt his gaze on me, warm and lingering. And a part of me wondered if I'd just crossed a line that I could never uncross. The following week passed in a haze of routines, yet my mind kept drifting back to those lingering touches and glances. I'd lie awake at night, replaying our conversations, the way Mark looked at me, the way his hand had lingered on mine. Part of me felt ridiculous, ashamed even. After all, I was nearly 70, and he was my daughter's husband. I had no business indulging in thoughts like this, no reason to allow myself to feel hopeful. But it wasn't just the attention that kept me hooked. It was something deeper. Since Jim's death, I'd grown accustomed to the dull ache of loneliness, the kind that settles into your bones over time. Mark's presence had stirred something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. He'd seen me in ways no one had, not even my own family. He'd made me feel valued, and for the first time since Jim passed, I felt like I mattered. One afternoon, Rachel was out of town for a work conference, and I was alone at home when I heard a knock at the door. It was Mark, standing on the porch with that easy, familiar smile. "Just thought I'd check in on you," he said, holding up a bag of groceries. "Brought some things for dinner, if you're interested." My heart leapt, but I kept my face neutral, smiling as I invited him in. We cooked together in the kitchen, falling into a comfortable rhythm. He chopped vegetables while I prepared the sauce, and we talked about his recent projects, my latest knitting attempts, and the books I was reading. It felt natural, like an ordinary evening, yet the air between us was charged with something unsaid. After dinner, as I gathered the dishes, Mark caught my hand, gently pulling me back. My heart raced as I looked up at him, searching his face for some hint of what he was thinking. For a long moment, we just stood there in silence, his hand warm over mine. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said words I never thought I'd hear. "You know, Sylvia, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. More than I should, maybe." I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a quiet intensity that left me stunned. I tried to speak, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All I could manage was a nod, my heart pounding as he continued. "I know this is complicated," he murmured, his gaze never leaving mine. "But I can't ignore how I feel. Being around you, talking with you, it's the only time I feel truly at ease, like I'm where I'm supposed to be." My mind raced, torn between shock, guilt, and an undeniable pull toward him. This was wrong, so wrong in every way. And yet, the part of me that had been starved of connection, of intimacy, couldn't ignore the way my heart responded to his words. "Mark," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "This isn't, we shouldn't." My voice trailed off, my hand still trapped beneath his, my resolve faltering as he looked at me with that steady, earnest expression. He took a step closer, his hand slipping from mine to brush gently against my arm. "I know, Sylvia. Believe me, I know. I've thought of nothing else. But I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you. Something real." In that moment, I felt as though the walls of the room were closing in on us. I knew I should step back, put an end to this, before it spiraled any further. But standing there, with his hand warm against my skin, I felt the years of loneliness, the ache of solitude, slip away. For the first time in so long, I felt desired, seen in a way that went beyond obligation or polite conversation. The pull was undeniable, and the decision to stay in that moment felt both reckless and liberating. I could see the same war in his eyes, the guilt mingling with an almost desperate need to hold on to whatever this was between us. After what felt like an eternity, I found the strength to step back, breaking the spell between us. We can't do this, Mark," I said, forcing the words out, though my voice shook with the effort. He nodded, his hand dropping to his side, though he didn't look away. "I understand," he said softly, his voice laced with regret. "I don't want to make things difficult for you. I just needed you to know." With that, he turned and left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, alone once more. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence more oppressive, as though it was pressing down on me, reminding me of all the things I'd lost, and all the things I could never have. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment over and over, torn between guilt and the lingering warmth of his touch. I knew I'd made the right decision by stepping away, yet a part of me couldn't shake the yearning, the craving for that connection, that intimacy that had been missing from my life for so long. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, hoping to push the memory aside, but every little thing reminded me of him. The scent of the kitchen where we'd shared that confession, the quiet hum of the radio, the empty chair across from mine. I realized then that things could never go back to the way they were, that I'd crossed an invisible line and left a piece of myself on the other side. Over the next week, I avoided Mark's visits, made excuses to stay busy, to avoid any chance of running into him. But the emptiness only grew, a hollow ache that seemed to expand with each passing day. I missed him in ways that frightened me, missed the warmth of his presence, the way he'd looked at me with that unguarded tenderness. It was foolish, irrational, and entirely unwise. And yet, each time I thought of him, a thrill surged through me, reminding me of what it felt like to be wanted, to be seen in a way that went beyond the surface. And as much as I tried to fight it, I knew that I was already in too deep. I don't know what I expected in the days that followed, but I was almost relieved when Mark didn't reach out. Perhaps he sensed that I needed space or understood the weight of what we'd both confessed. The silence between us felt like both a blessing and a burden. A part of me yearned for his presence, his warmth, yet another part was grateful for the distance that allowed me to regain my sense of control. But as the days turned into weeks, that initial sense of relief began to fade. I couldn't help feeling the ache of his absence, the emptiness that seemed even sharper now that I'd glimpsed what companionship could feel like again. I tried to push through, to ignore it, but every ordinary task reminded me of him. I saw him in the fresh vegetables he'd brought from his garden, the fix he'd made to my wobbly chair, the repairs that needed tending to, but now went untouched. One evening, Rachel called me with a request. She had a work event scheduled that ran late into the night, and she asked if Mark could come by to help me with some heavy boxes I'd been sorting through. I hesitated, but knowing I couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion, I reluctantly agreed. My heart pounded as I waited, telling myself that this would be a chance to clear the air, to re-establish boundaries and set things right. When Mark arrived, the air between us was thick with tension, but he greeted me with the same familiar smile, as if we were just friends. We exchanged polite words as he helped me carry the boxes down from the attic, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that we could go back to the way things were. But then, as we finished, he lingered, his gaze softening in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "Are you okay, Sylvia?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. I swallowed, avoiding his eyes. "Yes, of course. I've just been busy. That's all." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me, searching my face for something unsaid. And then, without warning, he reached out, his hand warm as it cupped my shoulder, grounding me in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. "Sylvia, I've missed talking with you. I know things got complicated," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't seem to stay away." I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach, but at the same time, the undeniable pull toward him was stronger than ever. "Mark, this isn't right." "You know that," I whispered, though my voice wavered with the weight of my own emotions. He nodded, his hand slipping from my shoulder, but he didn't move away. Instead, he leaned in, his gaze intense and filled with an emotion that left me breathless. "I know it isn't right, but sometimes things aren't so simple." In that moment, my resolve began to crumble. All the rational arguments, the reasons to walk away, they vanished, replaced by a longing that I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand brushing his cheek, and before I knew it, we were drawn together, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt both inevitable and forbidden. It was a moment of weakness, a surrender to something I could no longer resist. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my mind racing as the reality of what we'd just done sank in. We stood there in silence, both of us grappling with the enormity of the boundary we'd just crossed. I felt a surge of guilt, the weight of betrayal heavy on my conscience, but I couldn't deny the thrill, the exhilaration that surged through me. "Mark, we can't do this," I whispered, though even as I said the words, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. He looked at me, his expression pained, yet determined. "I don't want to hurt anyone, least of all Rachel. But there's something here, Sylvia, something I can't ignore." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to push him away, to end things before they went any further, but another part, a deeper, lonelier part, couldn't bear the thought of losing this connection. After years of solitude, of feeling invisible, this bond felt like a lifeline. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. We found reasons to meet, to linger in quiet corners where no one else could see. It was reckless, dangerous even, but the thrill was intoxicating, a pull I couldn't resist. Every touch, every glance was charged with a tension that made my heart race. And though I knew it was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. One evening, while Rachel was out with friends, Mark and I found ourselves alone again. He'd come by to help with a leaky faucet, and after the repairs were done, we sat in the living room, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the way his hand lingered on the armrest beside mine. "Sylvia," he murmured, his voice low and filled with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "Being with you, it feels like the only thing that makes sense." I looked at him, my heart pounding as I struggled to find the words. I feel the same, Mark. But what we're doing, it's not fair to Rachel. She deserves better than this. He nodded, his expression conflicted. I know. And I hate myself for putting you in this position. But I can't ignore what's happening between us. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his gaze left me unable to resist. We reached for each other then, our hands intertwining as we shared another kiss. A kiss that felt both liberating and damning. It was a kiss that blurred every line, every boundary, leaving us entangled in a web of emotions that I knew would only lead to heartache. As the days passed, our affair continued in secrecy, hidden in quiet corners and whispered moments. Each encounter was a reminder of the danger, the risk of discovery, yet the thrill of it all kept me coming back. I knew we were walking a fine line, that eventually, the truth would come to light. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. We were living on borrowed time, clinging to a fantasy that couldn't last. Yet in those stolen moments, I felt more alive than I had in years. It was a dangerous game, a reckless dance, and though I knew the cost, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. But deep down, I knew the truth. That sooner or later, we would be forced to face the consequences of our choices. And when that day came, I could only hope that I'd be strong enough to endure the fallout. Weeks passed, and each encounter between Mark and me grew more intense, more dangerous. Our secret weighed on me like a shadow, yet I found myself unable to resist the moments we stole together. When Rachel was home, I felt the guilt gnawing at me. Each laugh or smile she directed at me, a reminder of the betrayal I was hiding. Still, I couldn't stop. Every glance from Mark, every stolen touch, was like a spark that I craved in a way I didn't want to understand. Then came the day that changed everything. Rachel had to go out of town for a 3-day conference, and I was left alone in the house. I tried to distract myself with chores, to keep my mind from wandering to thoughts of Mark. But that evening, just as the sun began to set, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped as I opened it, finding Mark standing on the porch with that familiar, gentle smile. "I brought dinner," he said, holding up a takeout bag. "Thought you might like the company." I hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside to let him in, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. We settled in the kitchen, eating in comfortable silence, yet the air between us was thick with tension. Neither of us brought up the moments we'd shared, but they lingered, unspoken, filling every pause with a quiet intensity. After dinner, as I washed the dishes, Mark came up beside me, reaching for a towel to help. Our hands brushed, and I felt a jolt run through me, a familiar spark that left me breathless. I glanced up at him, and in his gaze I saw the same mixture of longing and conflict that had been haunting me for weeks. "Sylvia," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to make things difficult for you, but I can't ignore what's happening between us." I tried to look away, to pretend that his words didn't stir something deep within me. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore it either. I felt drawn to him in a way that defied reason, a way that made me feel alive in ways I hadn't felt since Jim's passing. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling, "this isn't fair to Rachel, or to you. We're playing with fire, and you know it." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know, but sometimes fire is the only thing that keeps you warm." Before I could respond, he reached for me, his hand cradling my face with a tenderness that left me breathless. I felt my resolve slipping, the walls I'd tried so hard to build crumbling as I leaned into his touch, letting myself surrender to the moment. His lips found mine, and in that instant, everything else faded away. The guilt, the fear, the consequences. All that mattered was the warmth of his embrace, the way he made me feel seen, cherished, wanted. We spent the night together, our connection deepening in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was a night filled with whispered confessions, stolen glances, and a quiet passion that left me feeling both liberated and haunted. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. as though I'd stepped out of a shadow I hadn't even realized was there. Yet, as dawn broke, reality began to settle in. The weight of what we'd done, pressing down on me like a vice. As Mark prepared to leave, he took my hand, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "I don't regret this, Sylvia, but I know we can't keep going like this. Sooner or later, someone will notice." I nodded, my heart heavy with the knowledge that he was right. We were walking a path that could only lead to heartache, yet the thought of ending things left me feeling hollow, as though I were losing something precious that I couldn't bear to let go. For the next few days, I tried to go about my routine, to push aside the memories of that night. But the more I tried to forget, the more those memories clung to me, haunting me in quiet moments, filling me with a mixture of longing and regret. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, that one wrong step would send me tumbling into a chasm I could never climb out of. And then, without warning, Rachel began to notice. It started with small things, questions she asked about Mark's visits, the way she looked at me when I stumbled over an excuse or tried to change the subject. I could feel her suspicion growing, a tension that began to seep into our conversations, our shared moments. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Rachel turned to me, her expression serious, almost probing. "Mom, is everything okay? You've seemed distracted lately." I forced a smile, hoping to mask the panic that shot through me. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just getting older, I suppose." But I could see that my answer hadn't convinced her. There was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a hint of something that made my stomach churn with guilt. I knew that the walls were closing in, that the secret Mark and I had been hiding was growing too heavy to keep concealed. The next day, I met with Mark at a small coffee shop outside of town, a place where we could talk without fear of being seen. As I sat across from him, I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, knowing that our time was running out. "Mark, we need to stop this," I said, my voice barely audible over the clinking of dishes and murmurs of nearby conversations. "Rachel is starting to notice, and I can't keep lying to her." He nodded, his expression pained, but he didn't argue. "I understand, Sylvia. I knew this day would come, but that doesn't make it any easier." I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine, and for a moment, we simply sat there, letting the weight of our shared decisions settle between us. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we'd shared, the bond that had brought us together, even as it threatened to tear us apart. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of loss that left me reeling. I knew that I'd made the right choice, that ending things was the only way to protect Rachel, to preserve the family we'd both risked so much for. But the pain of letting go, of walking away from something that had made me feel so alive, was almost unbearable. For days afterward, I moved through life in a daze, haunted by memories of Mark, of the moments we'd shared, the promises whispered in the dark. I knew that those memories would fade with time, that the pain would eventually lessen. But as I lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me would always belong to him, that the bond we'd shared would remain, a quiet, unspoken secret that only we could understand. And though I knew that I'd made the right choice, I couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be a day when I'd truly be able to let go. In the days after that defining moment, a strange emptiness settled into my life. Despite the heaviness of guilt and the knowledge of our mutual decision to stop, I found myself yearning for Mark. I felt like I was walking through my own home as a ghost, reliving moments we'd shared in each room, hearing his laughter in my mind, and feeling the warmth of his touch and memory. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt, hoping it would be him, only to feel a pang of disappointment when it was Rachel or a friend checking in. One evening, a few weeks later, I was outside in the garden, tending to the flowers I'd planted that spring. The sky was darkening, and just as I thought of going inside, headlights turned onto my driveway. My heart raced when I recognized Mark's car pulling in, and I could barely catch my breath as he stepped out, walking toward me with a determined expression. "Sylvia," he began softly, his eyes searching mine. "I know we said we should stop, but I can't stay away. I've tried, but I need to see you. Even if it's just like this, knowing you're here, that we can talk. That's enough for me." Every rational thought told me to turn him away, to insist we stick to the painful decision we'd already made. But as he stood there, earnest and vulnerable, I felt my resolve melt. I knew the risks, the potential hurt this could cause, but his presence stirred a need within me, a yearning that had grown louder and more insistent with each passing day. I nodded slowly, feeling both relieved and terrified. "Just talking," I whispered, more to convince myself than to clarify anything to him. And so began our strange secret affair. In a way, it felt like we were still clinging to our previous agreement, dancing around a line we didn't dare cross again. We'd meet at a small diner on the edge of town, or take long drives out to the lake, sharing quiet conversations that somehow only deepened the bond between us. We kept our meetings brief, careful not to let them spiral into something we couldn't control, but the connection was undeniable. Every touch of his hand or glance across the table felt like a promise, one we were both too afraid to break, yet unwilling to let go of. The nights were the worst. Alone in my room, I lay awake for hours, replaying our encounters, feeling the ache of his absence, even as I knew I couldn't ask him to be there. My conscience clawed at me, whispering reminders of the betrayal we were committing. Yet a part of me clung to this affair with a desperation I hadn't felt since my youth. It was a reckless choice, a dangerous path we'd both chosen. But in those stolen moments, I felt like I was living in a world that existed just for us, a place where nothing mattered but the way we made each other feel. But as our meetings continued, I couldn't ignore the guilt that loomed over me, growing heavier with each encounter. Every time I saw Rachel, I felt a pang of remorse that I couldn't shake. She was so happy, so trusting, and I knew that if she ever discovered our secret, it would break her heart. I tried to keep up the facade, to act as though nothing had changed, but I could see the cracks starting to show. I knew that our affair couldn't last forever, that eventually, one of us would have to make the choice to end it once and for all. And yet each time I met Mark, each time he held my hand or looked at me with that tender gaze, I felt the weight of my own weakness. I couldn't bring myself to walk away, couldn't bear the thought of losing this connection that had become my lifeline. It was wrong, I knew that, but the thrill, the sense of being truly seen and desired, was something I couldn't resist. As the days passed, our meetings became more frequent, each one more intense than the last. The boundaries we'd set began to blur, and I found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions that left me breathless and terrified. I knew that we were playing with fire, that the consequences of our actions would eventually catch up to us. But in those stolen moments, as we shared quiet conversations and tender embraces, all the guilt and fear faded away, replaced by a sense of freedom and fulfillment that I hadn't felt in years. And though I knew that our affair was built on lies, on secrets that would eventually come to light, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Each encounter felt like a chapter in a story that I couldn't put down, a tale of forbidden love and reckless passion that I knew would end in heartache, yet I couldn't resist turning each page. As the weeks turned into months, the guilt that had been gnawing at me grew unbearable. I could no longer look Rachel in the eye without feeling the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me, and I noticed the change in her demeanor as well. She was perceptive, my daughter, and I could see her watching me. Her brow furrowed with concern whenever I stumbled over my words or seemed distant. One evening, as we were having dinner together, Rachel looked up from her plate, her expression serious. "Mom, you've been acting different lately. Is everything okay? You just seem, I don't know, distracted." I forced a smile, trying to brush off her concern. "Oh, it's nothing, honey. Just things on my mind. You know how it is." But I could tell she wasn't convinced. She studied me, her gaze searching, and I felt a flicker of fear as I realized just how close she was to discovering the truth. I knew that if she ever found out about Mark and me, it would shatter her trust in both of us, destroy the family we'd both worked so hard to build. The tension between us grew in the following days. An unspoken tension that made every conversation feel strained, every interaction filled with a sense of impending doom. I tried to keep up the facade, to act as though everything was normal, but the cracks were beginning to show. Rachel noticed every hesitation, every slip of my composure, and I could see the doubt growing in her eyes. The guilt became a constant companion, haunting me in every quiet moment, every stolen glance with Mark. I knew that I had to end things, that the only way to protect my relationship with Rachel was to let go of the connection I'd built with Mark. But the thought of losing him, of severing the bond that had become my refuge, was almost too painful to bear. Each time I saw Mark, I felt the weight of my own selfishness, the knowledge that our affair was a betrayal of the very people we loved. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away, couldn't bear the thought of losing the one person who made me feel alive. It was a twisted paradox, a choice between loyalty to my daughter and the undeniable pull I felt toward Mark. A pull that I couldn't resist no matter how hard I tried. I knew that the day would come when I'd have to make a choice, when I'd have to put an end to the affair that had become both my salvation and my damnation. But as the days slipped by, I found myself clinging to every moment, every whispered word, as though I could somehow hold on to both the life I'd built with Rachel and the connection I'd found with Mark. I was walking a tightrope, teetering on the edge of disaster, and though I knew that one wrong step would send me plummeting into ruin, I couldn't bring myself to step back. The day came sooner than I'd anticipated, and it struck with the quiet devastation of a storm on a still night. I was sitting in the living room, knitting by the window as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, when I heard Rachel's car pull up outside. I expected her to walk in as usual, with her warm smile and light banter about work, but as soon as I saw her face, I knew something was wrong. She stepped inside, her expression taut, her eyes red-rimmed as though she'd been crying. My heart pounded, and I set my knitting aside, instinctively standing to greet her. "Rachel, is everything all right?" She closed the door behind her slowly, almost deliberately, and for a long moment she just looked at me, her gaze intense and piercing. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm, to nod. "Of course, sweetheart. You can ask me anything." She took a shaky breath, folding her arms as though bracing herself. "Have you been seeing Mark? I mean, behind my back?" The word struck me like a blow, and for a split second I felt my entire world tilt. My mind raced, my heart hammering as I tried to gather my thoughts, to form some kind of response. I opened my mouth to deny it, to assure her that she was mistaken, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was a pain there, a wounded vulnerability that left me feeling raw and exposed. "Rachel, The words caught in my throat, my voice breaking as the weight of my guilt crashed down on me. I couldn't lie, not to her, not with the truth hanging so heavily between us. Her expression shifted, a look of devastation washing over her face as my silence confirmed what she'd feared. She took a step back, as though I'd struck her, her gaze filling with tears that she quickly wiped away. "How could you, Mom? How could you betray me like this?" "I didn't mean to hurt you, Rachel," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my own remorse. It just happened. I know that's not an excuse, and I can't tell you how sorry I am." She shook her head, a bitter smile curving her lips as she let out a soft, humorless laugh. "So that's it? It just happened? You were supposed to be my mother, the one person I could always trust. And now? Now I don't even know who you are." The sting of her words left me reeling, the realization of how deeply I'd hurt her cutting through me like a knife. I reached out, desperate to offer some kind of comfort, but she pulled back, her expression hardening as she wiped her tears away. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Mom. I don't want to hear anything from you right now," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I need time to think. I need space." With that, she turned and left, slamming the door behind her, leaving me standing alone in the silence of the empty house. I felt a hollow ache settle into my chest, a heaviness that left me feeling as though I were drowning. I'd betrayed her trust, shattered the bond we'd shared, and in that moment, I knew that I might never be able to repair the damage I'd caused. I sank into the nearest chair, my mind numb as I tried to process what had just happened. The weight of my actions pressed down on me, the enormity of my mistake leaving me feeling hollow and broken. I'd lost Rachel, lost the relationship that had once meant everything to me, and I knew that I'd have to live with the consequences of my choices for the rest of my life. Later that night, Mark called, his voice filled with the same mixture of regret and sorrow that had been haunting me since Rachel had left. We spoke in hushed tones, both of us grappling with the enormity of what we'd done, the pain we'd caused to the person we both cared about. "It's over, Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to let go for Rachel's sake." He didn't argue. He understood, as I did, that our affair had been a mistake, a dangerous game that had cost us more than we'd ever anticipated. We said our goodbyes, our voices filled with sorrow and regret, and I knew that this would be the last time I'd hear from him. As I hung up the phone, a sense of finality settled over me, a quiet acceptance that left me feeling both empty and strangely at peace. I knew that I'd made the right choice, that ending things was the only way to begin to make amends for the damage I'd caused. But the pain of letting go, of walking away from a connection that had once brought me so much joy, was a wound that I knew would never fully heal. In the days that followed, I tried to reach out to Rachel, leaving voicemails and sending messages, but she didn't respond. The silence between us was a constant reminder of my mistake, a haunting echo of the betrayal that had shattered our family. I knew that rebuilding our relationship would take time, that I'd have to earn back her trust one small step at a time. But in those quiet moments, as I sat alone in the empty house, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever truly be the same. It's been a few years now since that dark chapter of my life, and though time has softened some of the pain, the scars remain, a constant reminder of the choices I made and the people I hurt. Rachel and I have managed to rebuild a semblance of our relationship, but there's a distance between us that wasn't there before, an unspoken understanding that some wounds never fully heal. We meet for lunch occasionally, exchanging pleasantries and polite smiles, but I can see the guarded look in her eyes, the flicker of doubt that lingers whenever she looks at me. I've come to accept that this is the price I must pay, that our bond will always bear the weight of the betrayal I inflicted upon her. As for Mark, I haven't seen or spoken to him since that final goodbye. I don't know what became of him, whether he found peace or continued to carry the same burden of regret that haunts me. I imagine he's moved on, perhaps found solace in his own way. But a part of me knows that our shared secret, the memory of those stolen moments, will forever be a part of us, a hidden scar that binds us in ways that only we can understand. Looking back, I realize that our affair was a mistake, a dangerous game that cost me more than I was prepared to lose. In my loneliness, my yearning for connection, I'd let myself become swept up in a fantasy, blinded to the reality of the pain I'd cause. And though I've come to terms with my actions, there's a part of me that will always carry the guilt. The knowledge that I crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I share this story not for sympathy or forgiveness, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder of the consequences that come from giving in to temptation, from letting loneliness and desire lead us down a path that can only end in heartache. I know now that some boundaries are meant to be respected, that some choices, once made, can never be undone. And as I sit here, reflecting on the life I've built in the wake of that affair, I find a strange sense of peace in the knowledge that I've learned from my mistakes, that I've chosen to face the consequences and work toward rebuilding the trust I lost. So if you're listening, if you've ever felt the pull of temptation, the allure of the forbidden, remember my story. Remember the cost, the pain, and the scars that remain. And know that while the thrill may be fleeting, the damage it leaves behind is something you may carry for the rest of your life. The straps of my sundress fell from my shoulders at the worst possible moment, leaving me frozen in front of the mirror as I fumbled with my bra. The faint creak of the bedroom door pulled my attention, and when I turned, there he was. Ethan, my stepson, standing in the doorway. My heart stopped. His hand lingered on the doorknob, and for a moment he didn't move. Neither did I. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You shouldn't be here." I stammered, yanking the straps back into place, though my cheeks burned with the humiliation of being caught like this. But he didn't leave. He stood there, his gaze flickering from the undone straps to my face, an expression I couldn't quite place crossing his features. "Ethan," I said sharply, breaking the silence. "Right," he muttered, finally stepping back and closing the door behind him. I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. It was an accident, I told myself. Just an awkward moment that neither of us would talk about again. But even as I thought it, I couldn't shake the way his eyes lingered, the way the air felt heavier in that fleeting moment. By the time I ventured out of the bedroom, Ethan was in the kitchen, casually scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. But when his gaze met mine across the room, I knew. Whatever line had existed between us was no longer there. It had been crossed. I married Daniel 10 years ago. He was older, established, and offered me the stability I craved after a tumultuous first marriage. His charm was quiet, his demeanor controlled, and his promises of a calm, steady life were enough to convince me that this was what I needed. Our house, a sprawling modern home perched at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, became my kingdom. But it also became my cage. Daniel's job as a corporate consultant meant he was rarely home. At first, I filled my days with charity events, book clubs, and home renovations. But over the years, the distractions lost their luster. The house grew quieter, the echoes of my own thoughts louder. When Ethan moved in after finishing university, it was meant to be temporary. A few months, Daniel said, until Ethan found his footing in the job market. I hadn't seen him much in the years since Daniel and I married. He lived with his mother, Karen, across the country. I wasn't prepared for the man who walked through the door. Ethan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered from our first meeting. At 24, he was tall and confident, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without trying. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, his sharp blue eyes quick to catch everything around him. He carried himself with an ease that Daniel never had, his humor sharp but never cruel. At first I thought it was my imagination, the way he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, the way he leaned against the counter and asked about my day as if he genuinely cared. But over time, I began to notice other things. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when I walked into the room. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he always seemed to find reasons to be close. The incident with the dress changed everything. It wasn't just the moment itself, the intimacy of being caught in such a vulnerable position, but the way it lingered between us afterward. Ethan didn't mention it, and neither did I. But the tension between us grew, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, about a week later, we were sitting in the living room. The TV played softly in the background, but neither of us was watching. I was reading, or at least pretending to, while Ethan scrolled on his phone. "Do you ever feel like this house is too big?" he asked suddenly. I looked up, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes still on his phone. "It just feels empty sometimes, like it's meant for more people." I set my book down, studying him. "You didn't grow up here. It's always been like this for me." He glanced at me then, his gaze steady. "Doesn't it get lonely?" His question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "Sometimes," I admitted finally. Ethan nodded as if he already knew. "Me too." Daniel called later that night, his voice distant as usual. He was staying an extra 2 days for meetings, leaving the house to Ethan and me. After I hung up, I wandered into the kitchen to make tea. Ethan was already there, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. "Late call from Daniel?" he asked, his tone casual. "Another extension," I said with a shrug. Ethan smirked. "Does he even live here anymore?" The question stung more than I expected. "Work is important to him," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Must be nice," Ethan replied, his voice soft but pointed. "To be so busy you don't notice what's happening right in front of you." I frowned, unsure of his meaning. "What are you talking about?" Ethan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said after a moment, his lips twitching into a small smile. "Just thinking out loud." But the weight of his words lingered long after he left the room. The following day, I found myself in the garden, pruning the roses that lined the stone path. Ethan appeared behind me, his footsteps light as he joined me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice easy. I glanced at him, surprised. "You know anything about gardening?" "Not a thing," he admitted, grinning. I handed him the shears anyway, guiding him as he awkwardly trimmed a few branches. His hands were steady, his movements precise as he followed my instructions. "This is kind of relaxing," he said after a while. I laughed softly. "Better than staring at your phone all day?" "Much," he said, his gaze meeting mine. The moment stretched, and I felt the now familiar flutter of tension between us. I looked away first, my cheeks warming under his steady gaze. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The way he moved through the house, the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to see through every carefully constructed wall I had built. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination born from too much time alone. But deep down, I knew better. Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. And whatever was happening between us wasn't something I could ignore. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore. It simmered in every conversation, lingered in every glance. I told myself it was my imagination, a byproduct of loneliness and too much time alone with him in the house. But the truth was harder to face. Something had shifted, and neither of us seemed willing, or able, to stop it. The breaking point came one quiet evening. The house was dim, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner of the living room. I was curled up on the couch with a book, a glass of wine beside me, while Ethan sat on the floor, leaning against the coffee table as he scrolled through his phone. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "Regret what?" "Marrying my dad," he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to his words that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, setting his phone down. "Just curious. You don't seem happy." His words hung in the air, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. "Marriage isn't always about happiness," I said finally. "What is it about then?" "Stability. Partnership. Building a life together." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sounds more like a business deal." I didn't respond, the truth of his observation stinging more than I cared to admit. The next day, the tension between us came to a head. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when Ethan walked in. He moved to the sink, washing his hands as I wiped down the counters. "I didn't mean to upset you last night," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "You didn't," I replied, though my tone was sharper than I intended. He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "You don't have to pretend with me, Miranda." I froze, my breath catching. "What do you mean?" I see it," he said, stepping closer. "The way you keep everything bottled up, the way you're always trying to hold it together. I shook my head, stepping back. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? He asked, his gaze steady. You deserve more than this, more than him. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I said, Ethan, you can't say things like that. Why not? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Because it's wrong, or because it's true? The first time it happened, it was almost accidental. We were in the library. The door closed behind us as we sorted through old photo albums Daniel had asked me to organize. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacks of pictures, while Ethan leaned against the desk, flipping through an album. Your dad was handsome when he was younger, I said, pointing to a photo of Daniel in his 20s. Ethan smirked. You mean he peaked early? I laughed, shaking my head. Don't be mean. He looked up then, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. You're beautiful, you know that? The compliment caught me off guard, my cheeks warming. Ethan? I mean it, he said, his voice lower now. You're incredible. I should have stopped him. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, done anything but what I did next. Instead, I met his gaze, my heart racing as I saw the sincerity in his eyes. And then he was kneeling in front of me, his hand brushing against mine. Tell me you don't feel it too, he whispered. I couldn't. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Every moment we spent together felt like walking a tightrope, the thrill of what we were doing tempered by the fear of being caught. We were careful, always watching for prying eyes, but the secrecy only heightened the intensity of our connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, the scent of roses heavy around us. Ethan reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. This can't last, I whispered, my voice trembling. Then let's make the most of it, he said, his gaze steady. The first crack in our secret came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Ethan's closest friend. He stopped by one afternoon, his easy charm masking a sharpness that made me uneasy. You've got a nice setup here, Marcus said as he sat on the edge of the couch, his eyes flicking around the room. We like it, I replied, forcing a smile. Marcus's gaze lingered on me a moment too long before he turned to Ethan. You're lucky, he said, his tone light but pointed. Not everyone gets to come back to this. Ethan tensed beside me, his posture stiffening. Marcus, don't. Don't what? Marcus asked, feigning innocence. Just making an observation. The conversation shifted after that, but the unease in the room didn't fade. Later that night, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression tense. He knows something, he said, his voice low. Marcus, my stomach twisting. Ethan nodded. He's not stupid, and he's always been nosy. What do we do? I asked, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. We keep quiet. He doesn't have proof. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach didn't ease. Secrets have a way of inviting complications, and ours was no different. It wasn't long before the fragile world Ethan and I had built began to show cracks. The first complication came in the form of Marcus, whose easy grin and playful banter masked a sharper, more calculating nature. It started with a casual visit. Marcus appeared at the door unannounced one Saturday afternoon, a six-pack of beer in hand and a smirk on his face. Ethan had been helping me rearrange the bookshelves in the library, his usual charm making the tedious task feel less burdensome. Looks cozy in here, Marcus remarked as he strolled in, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Marcus, Ethan said, his voice edged with surprise. What are you doing here? Thought I'd swing by, Marcus replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. Catch up, maybe. Didn't realize you were so busy. I forced a polite smile, stepping back from the bookshelves. We were just finishing up. Marcus's gaze flicked between us, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. Didn't mean to interrupt. The tension in the room was palpable, and I excused myself quickly, retreating to the kitchen. But even from there, I could hear their conversation, Marcus's teasing tone, Ethan's clipped responses, the subtle undertone of suspicion. Later that evening, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression tight. Marcus is nosy, he said, his voice low. He's your friend, I replied, though the unease in my chest mirrored his. That doesn't mean he doesn't notice things, Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. He knows me too well. What do you think he suspects? I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan hesitated, enough to be dangerous. The second complication came from Sophia, Daniel's business partner, whose sharp wit and unrelenting curiosity made her an unwelcome presence in my life. Sophia had always been more involved in Daniel's affairs than I was comfortable with. She had a knack for making herself indispensable, her loyalty to him bordering on obsessive. "You look tired, Miranda," Sophia said one afternoon as she stopped by the house to drop off some documents for Daniel. I forced a smile, brushing off her comment. "It's been a busy week." "Busy with what?" she asked, her gaze sharp. "Just the usual," I replied, though the weight of her scrutiny made my pulse quicken. Sophia's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Daniel's lucky to have you holding things down at home. Not everyone could handle it." The insinuation in her tone wasn't lost on me, and I felt a flicker of unease. Sophia was the type to dig deeper than she needed to, and her presence felt like a threat I couldn't afford to ignore. The walls began to close in after that. Marcus's visits became more frequent, his jokes laced with an edge that left me uneasy. Sophia's questions grew more pointed, her appearances at the house less about business and more about observation. One evening, as I stood in the garden pruning roses, Sophia appeared unexpectedly. "Beautiful flowers," she said, her voice startling me. I turned to find her standing at the edge of the garden, her arms crossed. "Sophia, I didn't hear you come in." "Daniel asked me to drop off some contracts," she said, her tone casual. "I thought I'd check the garden while I was here. It's always so peaceful out here." I forced a smile, though my hands trembled as I set down the shears. "It is one of my favorite places." Sophia stepped closer, her gaze flicking to the window where Ethan stood, watching us from the living room. "Ethan's grown into quite the young man, hasn't he?" My chest tightened. "He has." She tilted her head, studying me. "You seem close." "We've had more time to spend together lately," I said, keeping my tone light. "Must be nice," Sophia replied, her smile sharp. "Not everyone gets that kind of connection with their stepchildren." The turning point came during a dinner party at the house. Daniel had insisted on hosting, a rare display of enthusiasm that left me scrambling to prepare. Marcus and Sophia were both in attendance, their presence an unwelcome reminder of the precariousness of my situation. Throughout the evening, I felt their eyes on me, their subtle remarks and probing questions like needles under my skin. "You and Ethan make quite the team," Marcus said at one point, his tone light but his gaze piercing. "Ethan's been a big help," I replied, forcing a smile. "Must be nice having him around," Sophia added, her gaze sharp. "Especially with Daniel gone so often." I felt the blood drain from my face, but before I could respond, Daniel appeared, his hand on my shoulder. "Miranda keeps everything running smoothly," he said, his tone warm but possessive. For a moment, the tension in the room felt unbearable, the weight of their scrutiny suffocating. After the guests left, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "They're trying to trap you," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied, my hands trembling as I washed the dishes. "We need to be more careful," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Ethan, this can't go on." His gaze softened, and he reached for my hand. "I won't let them ruin this. I won't let them ruin us." The conviction in his voice was enough to steady me, but the unease in my chest lingered. As the days passed, the cracks in our secret grew wider. Marcus's probing questions, Sophia's veiled remarks, Daniel's oblivious presence, it all felt like a ticking time bomb, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. It started small, as these things often do. A misplaced item, a question asked too casually, a glance held a second too long. But small things have a way of snowballing, and before I knew it, the walls were closing in around us. The first major crack came when Daniel confronted me about my behavior. It was late, and the house was quiet. I was in the bedroom, brushing my hair in front of the mirror, when Daniel walked in. His tie was loose around his neck, and the faint smell of scotch clung to him. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone even but laced with suspicion. I paused, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "I don't know what you mean." "You've been distracted," he pressed, stepping closer. "Is something going on I should know about?" My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I've just been busy. The house, the garden, it's a lot to manage." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that all it is?" Of course, I said, turning to face him. What else would it be? He studied me for a moment longer before nodding. I hope you're not keeping anything from me, Miranda. You know how important honesty is to me. His words felt like a warning, and I forced a smile, my stomach churning as he turned and left the room. Things only escalated from there. A week later, I found Sophia in the kitchen, her phone on the counter, as she poured herself a glass of water. Hope you don't mind, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I let myself in. I wasn't expecting you, I replied, my tone cooler than I intended. I had some documents for Daniel, she said, her gaze flicking to the living room where Ethan sat, engrossed in his laptop. I thought I'd drop them off. Her eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment too long before she turned back to me, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. He's quite the presence, isn't he? I asked, feigning ignorance. Ethan, she said, her tone light but pointed. He's grown up a lot since I last saw him. You must be proud. Of course, I said, my pulse quickening. Sophia's smile widened. It's nice, isn't it? Having him around must make the house feel a little less empty. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I forced a laugh. It's been a change, that's for sure. That evening, as Ethan and I sat in the library, I told him about Sophia's remarks. She's watching us, I said, my voice trembling. She doesn't know anything, Ethan replied, his tone firm. She suspects something, I insisted. And Marcus isn't helping. He's been poking around too much. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. We'll deal with them, together. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of our situation felt heavier with each passing day. The breaking point came when Marcus cornered me at a neighborhood event Daniel had insisted we attend. The evening had been tense from the start, with Sophia hovering too close and Marcus's gaze following me wherever I went. I was stepping outside for air when Marcus appeared, his grin sharp and knowing. Enjoying the party? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. It's fine, I replied, my voice clipped. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. You know, you're not as subtle as you think you are. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay composed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Miranda, he said, his grin widening. I see the way you and Ethan look at each other. I've seen enough to know what's going on. You're imagining things, I said, my voice trembling. Am I? He asked, his tone mocking, because I've got a pretty good imagination. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared, his expression unreadable. What's going on here? Just making conversation, Marcus said smoothly, his smirk never fading. Daniel's gaze shifted between us, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Miranda, can I talk to you for a moment? Of course, I said, my heart pounding as I followed him back inside. Daniel's confrontation that night was quieter but no less devastating. You and Marcus seemed awfully tense, he said, his tone measured. Marcus was being inappropriate, I said, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Daniel frowned. Inappropriate how? He made a comment about Ethan, I said, choosing my words carefully. Something about how close we've become. Daniel's frown deepened. And what did you say? I told him he was imagining things, I replied, meeting his gaze. Daniel studied me for a moment before nodding. Good, I won't have anyone spreading rumors about this family. His words were a relief. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the rumors became impossible to ignore. The final twist came when Sophia revealed her hand. She stopped by the house one afternoon, her usual charm replaced by a quiet intensity that set me on edge. I thought you should know, she began, her voice calm but firm, that Marcus has been talking. A lot. What are you talking about? I asked, my stomach twisting. About you and Ethan, she said, her gaze unwavering. I don't know if it's true, but Daniel won't take it well if he hears it from someone else. I froze, my mind racing. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want to see this family fall apart, Sophia said, though her tone lacked sincerity. Her words were a warning, and I knew our time was running out. The storm broke on a quiet evening. The house was still, with only the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. I had been pretending to read, my eyes scanning the same line of text over and over, when Daniel walked in, his expression sharper than I'd ever seen. Miranda, he said, his voice flat, we need to talk. My stomach dropped. I closed the book, setting it aside. What is it? Daniel remained standing, his gaze cold and calculating. Sophia told me something disturbing today, something about you and Ethan. The air left my lungs, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. What did she say? She said Marcus has been spreading rumors, Daniel replied. He claims there's something inappropriate going on between you and my son. I stood, my legs trembling. That's absurd. Marcus has always been jealous of Ethan. He's trying to cause trouble. Daniel crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. Then why would Sophia feel the need to warn me? Why would Marcus even think he could say something like that? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking, but it's not true. Daniel stepped closer, his presence towering over me. Look me in the eye, Miranda, and tell me you haven't crossed any lines. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My silence hung between us like a confession. At that moment, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. Leave her alone, he said, his voice firm. Daniel turned, his eyes narrowing. So it's true? No, Ethan said quickly, but you're harassing her over some ridiculous rumor. She doesn't deserve this. Don't lie to me, Daniel snapped. I know when someone is hiding something. Ethan squared his shoulders. And I know when someone is looking for a scapegoat. You're never here, Dad. You have no idea what goes on in this house. Daniel's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. Don't you dare lecture me about this family. This family? Ethan shot back, his voice rising. You don't care about this family. You only care about control. You've ignored Miranda for years, and now you're acting shocked that she might find comfort elsewhere? Ethan, I said sharply, but it was too late. Daniel turned to me, his expression a mix of fury and betrayal. So it's true? The confrontation spiraled out of control. Daniel shouted accusations, Ethan hurled truths, and I stood frozen in the middle, unable to stop the chaos. Finally, Daniel pointed to the door. Get out, he said to Ethan, his voice low and venomous. You're no longer welcome in this house. You can't do that, I said, stepping between them. Daniel's gaze turned to me, cold and unyielding. You can go with him, Miranda. If this is the life you've chosen, then you've made your decision. Ethan grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the door. Let's go, he said, his voice softer now. I hesitated, my heart breaking as I looked at Daniel one last time. But his face was stone, his love for me replaced by anger and disgust. I turned and walked out, leaving behind the life I had built for the uncertain promise of what lay ahead.